Record.
There we go.
All right, we're live. So we're live, and welcome to this particular webinar sponsored by SaaS Alerts. It's called The Silent Killer, BEC, The Silent Killer. And the reason I wanted to have this is for those that I'm sure are aware, I shouldn't say are sure aware, but are you aware of the proliferation and the ever-changing tactics, techniques, and procedures of business email compromise? If you are, it's probably no shock that these are constantly evolving by threat actors. And so much so that we're starting to see the cyber insurance world start to wake up in terms of how we are both protecting and detecting when it comes to Azure, Azure AD, which is becoming obviously the de facto, if you will, for managing identity, and then your M365 or O365 environments, whichever flavors you're selling out there. And I wanted to get Spencer's perspective because in the world of SaaS alerts, where we have, a community where we talk week in and week out to companies that are both using SaaS alerts and or evaluating SaaS alerts, one of the questions is, are you monitoring all of your customers' environments in the cloud, all their SaaS applications, specifically though, ones when it comes to identity? And often the answer is no. And the question then becomes, why? And often it's because we're not getting paid to. So now we're starting to see insurance companies saying, well, hey, this should be part of what you're doing, just like EDR, MFA, et cetera. So that's the kind of the setting the stage for today's presentation or conversation. I do want to real quickly put something in chat for you all to see. And that is a recent release from CISA on business email compromise. Can you guys maybe in chat just let me know if you can see that? If you're in the audience, can you guys access that? Perfect. Thanks for letting me know, Michael. So it's just really, here's the main reason I wanted to put this out there is because when we think business email compromise, right, we think ways in which we're going to get people to do typically some type of wire fraud. But again, as we evolve, we always seem to be a step behind as defenders. As we evolve saying, well, we got to look out for X, we got to look out for Y, and we got to look out for Z, you're noticing that the threat actors are evolving. And this was an interesting one here, Spencer, as I let you introduce yourself, in that the TTPs, commonly called tactic, techniques, and procedures, as described by MITRE, the MITRE attack framework, the threat actors are now moving into supply chain in terms of food and products. So spoofing emails and websites to get big suppliers of sugar and milk products and everything to send large amounts of product. So it's interesting, isn't that how things continue to evolve? But that's really the gist of that latest bulletin. So Spencer, with that, please tell us a little about yourself and welcome and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. Definitely an important topic. So as you know, my name is Spencer Pollock. I'm a privacy cybersecurity breach attorney with McDonald Hopkins. Our group has handled probably around 11,000 privacy incidents. I've handled about 600. These include business email compromise, ransomware, data extortion, data exfiltration. I mean, you name it in the cyber world, we do it. We also do a lot of the front end compliance work. We work with a lot of MSPs as well to help them navigate their clients and their client concerns. So yeah, we're kind of very much a holistic shop.
Yeah, and in fact, I'm going to have a poll put up for you, Spencer. We'll just find out real quick in terms of, Michelle, if you could put that up. And while that question's up, Spencer, does your MSP work with a breach attorney? Can you tell us a little bit about level set what a breach attorney does? Talk maybe left and right of boom and why, either a MSP or a customer actually works with a breach attorney before an incident. Kind of seems odd as you think about what a breach attorney does as you describe it, but then maybe you can kind of just lay that out there for us and demystify what's behind it.
So in terms of the left, I truly believe the left is almost more important than the right, because the left is how you get prepared. And one of our big roles as a breach counsel and privacy attorney is, one, to make sure you're prepared for an incident. Make sure you're prepared in terms of compliance. A big issue we're seeing now are the metapixels, right? Metapixels, Google Analytics, chatbots, and how that information is being shared. And there's a lot of class actions out there now with that. So it's really trying to keep you in front of these issues and making sure you stay compliant, working with your clients and yourselves as an MSP to have those plans, procedures, protocols in place. Because then when a breach happens, we come in and we really quarterback the situation. Because no matter what industry you're in, no matter how large or how small, you have obligations, legal obligations. Every state's got a data breach notification law about what's been accessed or obtained about sensitive and personal information. So what we do, we come in, we'll bring in a forensic firm, the DFIR firm, digital forensic incident response firm. I know you all know that term though. And then we help coordinate at that point with law enforcement, liaisoning with them, helping with communications about what to say, what not to say during an incident. And then if it's determined it is as an actual data breach, we'll make sure that you stay compliant with those laws, right? We help with the letter drafting, with getting the message out, getting to the impacted individuals, getting to the regulators, helping with any class action or regulatory investigation. So it's kind of just the full shop service when it comes to privacy and cyber.
You made me think of something. I'm going to share one other little holiday gift here for you. If you don't follow me on LinkedIn, I did post this. It is the do's and don'ts of communications when it comes to an incident. Spencer put this together for the MSP and MSSP community. Happy holidays. There's a little treat for you to share amongst your company and your team. So Spencer, you mentioned quarterbacking, and when there's an incident and insurance is involved, their first thing they're going to do is get on the phone with you. There's going to be a breach attorney involved. So you have a lens. I'm setting the stage here that you have the lens of working with a lot of insurance companies. And, as we know, there's been, prolific losses over the last few years, so much so that it was actually the reinsurers, the big guys like the Lloyds of Londons of the world who are reinsuring policies that just said, hey, wait a minute. We're insurance companies. We don't lose money. And certainly the reinsurers don't lose money. So when the reinsurers start losing money, that's when you typically see change. And that's what we're seeing. So the reinsurers say, hey, look, here are the questionnaires. Here are the controls. They're much more prolific than they were previously. 5 questions previously in a heartbeat to 8, 9, 10 pages where, MFA everywhere, EDR, et cetera, but you're now starting to see, are you doing MFA on cloud resources and SaaS resources specifically? And then are you monitoring M365 Azure environments? Is this a trend? Is this an anomaly? Or, is this going to be just as important as MFA EDR? And what are your thoughts around this?
So I think you made a really good point to start about how fast the threats are evolving, right? From the legal community, from the MSP community, from the MSSP community, from the insurance community, from regulators, we're all trying to catch up, right? Because if you imagine, it's hard for us to guess what is next. Unfortunately, we have to be more reactive, just how fast we can be. But with that being said, the insurance world is also trying to catch up. And one thing we know now is from 2021, IBM puts out a security study, data breach study, and they found that 44% of all breaches are cloud-based. That number even surprised me in terms of how many, because a lot of times you'll hear from people being like, well, I'm in the cloud, I'm fine, right? I'm in the cloud. They have no idea what that really means. They just know they're in the cloud. But insurance companies, I think, are now recognizing that it really doesn't matter where you are. It matters the security that you have in place, right? Like, no matter the technology you could have the best technology in the world, but if you're not implementing it correctly and you don't have the security controls in place, it really doesn't matter. So I think we're going to see moving forward that insurance companies are going to say, okay, you need to have the MFA implemented across enterprise-wide, including Office 365 cloud-based applications. But you also need to make sure it's monitored, right? Because when you start seeing suspicious activity and nobody's doing anything about it, obviously the insurance company is going to look at that and be like, wait, why didn't you do anything at this point, right? Who was watching the hen house, right, at that point?
Right. So you kind of lead into the next thing, and I'm going to kind of look down because I want to get this kind of, forgive me all question correct with you here, Spencer. But, as MSPs, more than not, we're procuring, right, on behalf of the customer, even though Microsoft end user license is with the end customer, but we're procuring their O365, M365, their Azure tenants and things like that. And so there's a certain inherent, or the question is there, do you feel there's a certain inherent, MSA aside, general security that a customer is going to expect? And even though we might think, right, well, I spoke to the customer, I told them, etc., as a breach attorney, how are you going to look at this if an end customer is compromised and you start looking at, what is being done and what isn't? I just like your perspective on it.
Well, I think it's a big expectation setting conversation, right? And I think it's something we'll probably touch on more later. But when it comes to security, your clients think that you're doing everything, right? No matter if you're on-prem or if you're using the cloud-based providers, they're expecting you to keep them buttoned up, no matter what you've been saying. Now, when you start talking to them, well, let me step back. They have that expectation, right? They have that expectation around security, no matter if you're providing that or not. So you need to have those level setting conversations with them about what you're doing and not doing. They automatically think when you've now recommended something that you're usually going to be monitoring that for them, even though you might not be, because once again, it's probably not in your MSA. And so when you put it outside when you don't have it inside your MSA, they're still going to look at you and be like, well, you didn't exclude this, right? You're supposed to be our service provider and you recommended this. So why weren't you watching for suspicious logins? Why weren't you checking the logs on this? And if you don't have a really good expectation setting conversation with somebody, it's hard then to come back later and be like, well, no, I didn't mean that. You shouldn't have expected that I was doing this.
Yeah. And I put questions in there for everybody for chat. Again, we'd love your questions, comments, chat around this. You as the MSPs and MSSPs make this a lot more interesting if you start to throw some thoughts and comments in. But I'd love your, specifically what you think your clients believe, because, it's interesting. We've talked with Eric Tildes and, a lot, who's another attorney in the space that does a lot of things around MSAs, scopes of work. And he's kind of taken back that a lot of MSPs, Spencer, haven't post-COVID reviewed their MSAs. And so much has changed, right? In terms of security controls that we've put in place, who's responsible for what. So can you kind of just touch on that? Yes, there's expectation setting, but it's a tough conversation because there's really specificity, correct me if I'm wrong, that has to be in that MSA on who's responsible for what. And the last thing I'll say is so often, and maybe we'll get to this, I'm paraphrasing probably a question coming up, but MSPs often have, 724 monitoring on their websites, right? We do it all. We're your IT department. So how kind of frame out for us what your thoughts are, again, because you're oftentimes, the one that's going to get that, representation of the insurance company having to look at what's the MSP doing and not doing.
Yeah. And I think one of the big things is you're right. I've seen only a couple that we've helped with too. Well, then when it's come to my desk, I've only seen one or two that are really tight with an MSA. And I think that one actually had like exclusions saying we are not monitoring your Office 365 because you're not paying us to do that. it was almost like optional service, and it said like yes, no. And it was like, no, 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 no. Because that's what they chose, which I gave them a lot of credit for because it was a cheap review for the MSA because they already had things locked up for them. But I think having, and it is a difficult conversation, but if you don't have the conversation, then we have assumptions, right? And as someone who's dealt with MSPs on the other side, right? Because the majority of my clients that come in after a breach are not an MSP. They're usually the MSP's customer. The first thing someone says to me, and I say this every time Andrew and I talk, is the first person a client blames is their MSP. Like, I don't care how good you are. That is the first reaction in their mind. Now, when they calm down, the next question is what kind of relationship do you have with them and what are the expectations that you've set forth? Because you're right, the representation a lot of people are making out there is we're 24/7, we've got you buttoned up, we're doing all security. And it's kind of crazy to me, right? Because it's like if I was advertising for myself as a lawyer, as a cyber and privacy lawyer, saying, well, I do all this, but guess what? I also do tax law, right? And I am covering you. I'm doing a subscription service with you and I'm going to cover you on tax when I'm really not. So I get it. It's something sexy to say. It's really sexy to say 24/7. It's sexy to say security, but it's really dangerous because for me, when I've come in, the good MSPs, one, are very much proactive working with their clients, but they also have those expectations because I'm always transparent with a client. I'm like, they set the expectation for you. They have a really good MSA. They put all this. You click no down here. There's no expectation. Now, on the other side, unfortunately, the majority don't. And so when I go back to an MSP and I'm like, you've pro hoc been doing this. Like, I'm sorry if you're not charging for it one way or the other, but there's now that assumption that you were doing it. Even Office 365 environment, it doesn't really matter. And that's when they get really upset and defensive. But what I have to say to them, I'm like, look, my client assumed it because you had been talking to them. Once it's like pro hoc, right? It's just, they would come in randomly and help out rather than have that expectation about what you're going to do and what you're not going to do.
Yeah, I love it. I love what Roger said in chat. He's like, yes, they all, meaning the customers, think we're doing everything for them, makes having the conversation to upsell into a security oriented MSSP offering harder, which is true. But at the same time, I would say that, I would say we can lean on Roger that, post-COVID, the threat landscape has changed. And, it's almost like we're in battle and somebody decides to do a completely different tactic. It's not, we can't sit there and go, yeah, but we always did it this way and it's not working. And so I think we can lean on that. And I think Spencer, I think, I'm going to repeat what you said and how critical this is. And even using your MSA as a means to get back in front. Hey, a lot's changed, but Spencer, your words around expectations and what is in and not in that MSA really can hinge on whether the MSP is going to be pulled into this or not. Is that a fair statement, especially when it comes to a very solid MSA?
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, I think it is, I'll keep repeating it. Expectation setting, expectation setting, expectation setting. If you have solid expectations already set about what your role is, I mean, look, you can do security for them if you really want. I don't advise it, but if you want to, that's fine. One, accept the responsibility for it and the liability. Two, make sure you've carved out in your MSA exactly what you're doing and not doing, because the security side gets very specific. And then three, get that they're going to be expecting it. Now, if you don't have that stuff and you're just staying basically in your lane, make sure you're establishing your lane with that, right? Because once again, lack of expectations lead to confusion. Confusion leads to liability. Because when you have, and it's your client, and that's the biggest problem, right? You don't want to get into a war with your client because it's your customer and it's your reputation. So if you haven't laid these out very specifically, especially I feel the cloud-based environment has created a false sense of expectations on MSPs because of people thinking it's easier for an MSP to monitor. It's easier for them to be doing this. So they should be doing all of it, especially if you recommended it.
Yeah, and by the way, another thing, and Michael is making some great comments too. Even pull out things like, Spencer, the shared responsibility documentation from Microsoft. Hey, look, even Microsoft, right? The reason we, Mr. or Mrs. Client, the reason we need to review this is even Microsoft. Here's something that we need to talk about, not to sit there and have a conversation where it's going to gloss their eyes over, right? Because it's a fairly lengthy document, but maybe go in with some highlighted things. Microsoft saying this is what they're responsible for.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times, and rightly so, Mr. Client or Mrs. Client, the assumption is, well, it's Microsoft. Shouldn't they be responsible for that? No, they're responsible for their infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. You're responsible for on your specific tenant, your data, et cetera. One thing I'm just going to share, I'm going off topic here, but I do, because I think this is a tough conversation. Another way you can actually maybe have the conversation with them is pull out the cyber defense matrix. It's a really easy 5x5 grid. Spencer, maybe you can just look at chat real quick. Hey, just why for yes, I know about the matrix and I don't. But here's something that you could really easily bring out and say, hey, look, a lot's changed, right? As you know, a few years ago, we shifted you from on-prem Exchange into O365. Since then, since COVID, we've deployed, I'm making this up, right? We've deployed Teams and SharePoint, and we've shifted a lot of your data, right, that used to be in this file server up to the cloud. I really want to revisit all the things that we did, that we're doing, that have security, protection, and detection, and things that don't, so that we can be really clear on who's responsible for what, right? So let me just see what anybody court, yes, no, never seen it. Okay, cool. I'll put the URL in there, and glad to see some people have. That's awesome. So, Spencer, when you begin to speak with an MSP post event, right? Can you kind of walk us through how the conversation goes? Because, if I'm an MSP and my customer had an incident, right? And then maybe I'm done all the right things, right? Hey, we got to get your cyber insurance involved. Cyber insurance gets involved. They escalate to you. Mm-hmm. You're going to start to have some conversations. Hey, is there an MSP? So maybe kind of talk to us about, you interview the client says, I have an MSP. Can you kind of walk us through, so an MSP understands what's going to kind of happen and what kind of questions might come their way?
Yeah, I mean, I think the start, well, depending if let's say it's a business email compromise, I want to know who's monitoring the environment, on-prem or Office 365 or in the cloud. Doesn't really matter. I want to know who is monitoring, if anybody. While I wouldn't be that concerned to start about who was supposed to be, the client's going to definitely start asking those questions. If we're still sticking just specifically with the business email compromise, I would want to know what sort of preliminary investigation. A lot of times MSPs do, and you don't have a responsibility to do an investigation, but they always do. They'll look at suspicious IP logins, any forwarding, deletion, modification rules, and then in terms of helping track down the phishing email, I think that's one of the bigger parts too. Understanding the security controls that are in place, understanding the roles of the organization, if they don't have MFA across the board. So kind of those base level questions, we'll incorporate them. I try not to get into, when we bring in a forensic firm, we really lean on them to work with the MSP. Oh, obviously change passwords, right? I think that's the basic question to start. Have you changed all the passwords? And I'm surprised when I get a response of no. That would be the first question I would ask. And I fully encourage you, if a BEC does occur, to tell your client to do a password reset across the board. You could always wait for me to get involved, but I don't see that as a harm to reset passwords, unless it's, well, at least with let's see, now I got to step back, because now I'm thinking about the communications aspect. At least with the account that is compromised, reset that password. But But yeah, I would say those would be the base level questions with the business email compromise that we come in and start asking for. And then ask obviously what level of Microsoft, what's their tenant? Because the client's not going to know any of this. They're not going to have any idea what we're talking about. So we want to know if they're an E1, E3, E5, because we want to know what kind of logs we're going to be able to get for the forensic company.
Got it. And then Spencer, in terms of policy, right? Let's kind of go a little further. Business email compromise, hypothetically, I'm looking at Steven was the last one to comment. Yeah, Steven's talked to his customer like about, hey, you really should put a policy in place whenever, someone is doing a wire or requests a change. I noticed that you have no policy in place to enforce that. You would pick up the phone, that you would require, multiple signatures, that you would do this, and this. Again, are you, from a policy perspective, are you going to start asking those questions as well?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think the big question, because Andrew, you were right to start. The whole purpose of a BEC, BECs aren't sexy either. They're just not. That's why I think they're very much underestimated. Ransomware, data exfil, that's all much more of a sexy topic and more interesting. But BECs is where you get instant massive loss, right? Because of the wire fraud aspect. And then you get into the PII later. But the whole purpose of a BEC is the wire fraud. And unfortunately, a lot of times companies don't have a policy in place. So they'll get the social engineering, they'll get the spoofed email. I got one this morning asking me to, I don't know why they thought I was in accounting, nor would I have any money to wire them, but they thought I did. But it looks very legitimate. And it looks very much like, hey, they've social engineered, they've gotten to either your tenant or somebody else's tenant, and they know that you owe an invoice, and they'll contact you as that person, and they'll change just a couple of account numbers. And unfortunately, people don't have it in place to pick up the phone and call. All right, it's just like a rapid thing. It's like, we don't want to deal with it. Fine, we'll change the account number, we'll wire you $4 million. And what I found though is a lot of clients are mad at their MSPs for not, and this is one of the more ridiculous conversations, I will say that, are mad at their MSPs for not addressing these kinds of discussions with them. Because once again, you are their savior. They expect you to have these out of lane conversations. So I think you talking to customers and asking them this question is harmless, saying, what's your procedure in terms of changing an account, right? How are you as a customer? Because they're going to come back to you and be like, you need to help us track this down. And that's just like impossible, right? Yeah. That takes a very special, we've got a group within my firm that's really good at it. I stay away from it because it just does, I don't speak that language. Yeah. But they're going to expect that you're able to instantly help them. Yeah. But I think one thing proactively you can do to help prevent that big harm for a BEC is to work with them and talk to them about their policies, right? And get with external legal too, or internal legal. It doesn't really matter which one, to make sure that policy is not going to get them in trouble. But it's a really simple policy, truthfully. It's if somebody, and what I have clients put in emails is basically a statement saying, we would never ask you to, we would never ask you to transfer money to a new bank account without calling you. And that's like a disclaimer at the bottom of the email, right? Because that at least is going to protect that. Now, on the other side with clients, I've encouraged them to have a formal written policy that they train their staff on. A lot of people will say, well, yeah, it's common sense. Well, it's not common sense, unfortunately, because we move quickly. But what I've told MSPs in the past is talk to your clients about this, because you have access to, I don't know, whatever your client base is, right? A lot more clients to start than I do. And I think that's a big value add for you as an MSP to have that simple conversation. It costs no money either. And it also can lead to the next conversation about expectations in a business email compromise of what your role is expected versus what you're not expected to do.
Yeah, I love what you just said. And then I love what Michael said. People and process and product, we can help with too, but the people part is hard. And so I think, if you kind of unpack what you said, Spencer, that policy conversation really sets the stage for a nice tabletop exercise with a customer. And our question, yes or no, if you could just put in chat, are you guys having tabletop, doing tabletops with your customer? Are you charging for them? Because here's the thing, Spencer, I go say, Spencer, just curious, do you guys have a policy in place if one of your, customers says, or suppliers say, hey, change, this account number to this account number, walk me through that process. And if they say, no, we don't, say, okay, well, let's say, this happened, that, your customer that, customer of yours, or supplier rather, that you had to send money to, sends something to your accounting team changes it, and you wire out $1 million to the wrong account, you're out that $1 million. What happens?
What do you do?
What do you do? Who's responsible? And then if you walk them through this process, you're going to start to, number one, you're having a business conversation, which I love for us as MSPs, getting us away from technology conversations, getting us into business conversations, which then leads into, Spencer, maybe you talked about this just briefly, but again, we always think about the dollars in BEC. Can you give us some help and unpack the PII, I guess, concerns and what happens there from a reporting aspect, and that kind of unpack that for us, if you will.
So that brings up another point about expectations. They are expecting you to run their retention policy too, in their email inbox. So one of the biggest headaches in a BEC is, imagine how large your clients' mailboxes are, how much data is really in there. I mean, it ranges from whatever, I've seen 0 gigabytes up to 100. And then when you have multiple accounts that are compromised, I have one right now that it's 70. I'm not going to even, I think it's like 4 terabytes. It's a ridiculous number. 4 terabytes is probably high, but it's a ridiculous number. And one thing they're going to look to you for is, I'm telling you, every time when I ask, what's your retention policy in your email? They said, well, let me get my MSP on the phone. Like that, instantaneously. And that's not your job, but they're looking to you for that. Because the problem is when you're looking at all those emails, let's say it's an accounting person. Let's say it's HR. HR is the worst. Imagine the amount of social security numbers, amount of driver's license, amount of medical, amount of health insurance that is going to be contained in there. Everybody says that they don't accept it over email, but that's ridiculous. I mean, they do. I mean, I got one where it was an email compromise. There was one Excel sheet that had 150,000 names and socials that was in there. And it was a sync of the mailbox. We couldn't disprove that it was the harm. And then if you imagine if that's 150,000 people that we got to go notify, that's a huge problem. But stepping back, the data mining portion of it, if they don't have, let's just say there's no sync. Still the question is the access. A lot of states say that you only need to access this information. Well, if I don't have an E5 license, that becomes very difficult to determine, right? That's a huge question. And then they turn to you and say, well, why didn't you tell us to get this? Not trying to scare anybody about this, but I'm hoping that what I'm saying is giving you all some ideas to go talk to your clients to at least cover your bases. Because nobody gets the PII part. Nobody's got a retention policy, because a lot of times, unless you're medical, unless you're education, finance, most industries you don't have to keep all of this, right? And so they don't have like a 3-month deletion policy or it gets archived into a secure location. It just sits. The whole thing just sits. So having that conversation, I think, is important too, because once again, this is more, but make sure you're laying expectations too. Have a conversation around it, but don't make sure you're setting up that you are not in control of their retention policy unless they have now delegated that to you and you have that in your contract and you're being compensated and then you have taken that on, right? But I think one of the biggest aspects, business email compromise, is the PII involved beyond the wire fraud aspect, right? Because we don't know how much information. The data mining is always expensive. And then the notification is the reputational harm. I mean, it just is.
That's really interesting. Curious, if you guys could just maybe put a Y or no, yes for Y, N for no. do you talk to your customers about their data retention policies? I'd
Data
imagine.
governance policies.
What's that?
Data governance policy. I think data governance.
Policies. Yeah. I could see it happening maybe in, around the business continuity side, like are there files and data there? Do you see it more there? Just curious from your perspective, Spencer, versus cloud assets like their email, where, retention, it just, and how often, and by the way, do you see this too? And again, just wire and sorry, Spencer, it just popped into my head. But like, I mean, you're the executives in firms, right? No, expand my mailbox. I need more space, right? Do you guys ever hear that? Just keep, expanding the space. So, talk to us if you would, Spencer.
So, I mean, well, I think I look at it more of a global and holistic enterprise-wide approach, right? In terms of the data governance. And I might not be answering your question directly, but I mean, well, I guess is your question more going to like when the C-suite asks for the expansion, how can you kind of set better expectations with the C-suite?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm just saying that, again, coming back to, let me ask this. Are there room for exceptions? Because you get that, like MFA is a great one. Well, we'll all do it, but you know what? The president doesn't want to do it.
Yeah. So yes and no. I mean, I'm pretty strict when I'm talking to clients, being like, you either are all in or you're not all in.
Okay.
Because I don't remember who just said this, was your people are your weakest link. Testing.
Yeah.
She's right. And usually it's the C-suite people. And they are the biggest weakest link. So yes, I mean, look, I always put it up to the client. What I tell a client is like, I'm a heat-seeking missile. Just you point me in the direction you want me to go, but I'm going to probably warn you, you don't want to hit that city. But if you want to do it, you're going to do it. Not the best analogy probably anymore, but
right.
It's really up to them, but you really want to lay out the risks, right? And it's hammering that people are the weakest link. And just having a really blunt conversation, being like, okay, well, you want more space. Well, what are you doing with this? Like, but it's also then going to a global policies. Be really careful though, because you want to make sure they're legally compliant, right? Once again, there's two sides to everything. This is why I pair up with MSSPs and work with MSPs. Technical and legal, they are interwoven in all of this now because of the compliance aspect. But you need to have that conversation rather than just looking at a mailbox, just have them step back and be like, okay, well, why are you keeping all of this? Well, I like to find an email from a year ago. Why? What is in there, right? Because then that's going to classification. Right, let's start classifying sensitive public PII. Because let's figure out that. And if they keep pushing, you can also, I mean, look, I'm not technical, but from my understanding, you can do a lit hold, or you can do an archive, a secure archive, right? Where it gets moved over. So I'll leave that to the technical people. But it's just having a conversation of here are the risks involved. Here are the financial, legal, and reputational risks of having this massive mailbox. And, you can quantify how much it's going to cost to data mine something like that. And you can quantify it because we know it's like 4.8 million for a business email compromise on average now. So, I mean, depending how big a company is, I've had really tough conversations with the CEO and COO, whatnot, being like, here's how much it costs. What do you really need all this for? Like, I get it, it's convenient, but there's ways to protect it and not have it, and then you can go get it later.
Got it. Yeah, and Michael brings in a good part to your point around compliance, right in there with New York Shield, Spencer, hitting that point. So let's talk about documentation, Spencer. I'm going to come at it where we've kind of talked about this a little, but I want to really talk about documentation for MSPs because this is obviously an important aspect. The age old, you hear this still to this day. I'm trying to get my clients on, MFA across the board, right? It's hard. The cyber insurance wants MFA across the board. But I'm still maybe even struggling getting them to put it on, SaaS applications, right? Or, just, their O365. Anybody, by the way, still struggling with that with clients at all? Or, are you enforcing it, baking in? And I'd love to know, but let's just say, you know, I've tried it, I've done it, gone over and over, back and forth with their customer, they still won't do it. Talk to us about proper documentation here, Spencer, because again, when you know, there's this fine line of, right, seeming adversarial to the customer, right? Now, I have seen MSPs fire customers as a result, which again, easier said than done. But I'd love your comments here on documentation, because obviously this is, you know, really, it's one hand when you have, you know, the cyber insurance, you know, do it. But then again, they can even turn it off. It's a one-time check, which is going to change, you know, with telemetry over time. But
Yeah.
Love your perspective.
What I tell people is, like, you have that conversation, you recommend it, they say no. I think you go back, and not in a very much confrontational email, like waving it in their face, being like, I told you to do it, sign this attestation that you're not doing it. No, go back to them and say, look, just want to make sure, because human beings in general, we don't remember conversations. We just, unless you've got a great memory, too much is going on. And if it's not important to them, it's usually going in one ear out the other, but they're still going to blame you at the end for allegedly not recommending it. So to cover your bases, you go back and you say, look, we had this conversation. I told you, you know, I'm recommending that you do MFA across the board. I'm recommending that you implement security logging, whatever it is, right? Secure backups, whatever you're recommending, and they're not doing. And just be like, look, here's the best practices that I think. Now, from the legal side, I hate that, because like if I came in and you recommended that they didn't do it, I would probably want to slap that. But
because that hurts your case.
Oh God, yeah. I mean, I've seen it before too, where they're like, they didn't tell me that. And then we're on the phone and I'm like, did you tell them that? And then they bring up the email and I'm like, you're going to get disclaimed. Like, you're not going to have coverage, right? Because then they feel like they can blame the MSP. But it's not really, I look at it as like, when we work with clients, I give them like a privacy assessment, right? So they come back, they tell me they have this policy, they don't have this. And I go back and I put it in writing saying, look, here's what we recommend doing. You can work with us or not, all good. But at least they can't turn around later and be like, why didn't you tell us we need an incident response plan? And what I say is, no, we did. And I think the same thing for you all. And I think it's a really reasonable step that protects you and gives you that expectation setting, right? And working with them, what I would say too with the documentation is, and I'm not even selling myself, you can go get whatever privacy or breach counsel you want. We will be your best advocates, because the things you're recommending is the things we're going to be recommending. So amazingly, when I've come in and I asked them that question, I'm like, do you have MFA? Well, no. Well, didn't your MSP recommend it? Well, yeah. Well, you should do it. So it's learning to partner. If they've got internal legal, partner with them. And really, sometimes you're going to have to educate a lawyer, which I'm sure is a lot of fun, because lawyers are so reasonable. But educate them about why these are important, right? Beyond the technical, because they're not going to care about the technical. They will care about the compliance side. They will care if you start talking and start dropping numbers on them, right? And talking about how much money this will save them, how much this is going to prevent legal liability. So working in tandem, right? Creating that team environment. I work a lot with MSPs in a team environment where I'm representing their client. But truthfully, like I haven't had a case yet where a recommendation was so out of whack that I'm like, don't do that. So work in tandem with people and work in tandem with the MSSP too. That gives you the best layer of technical protection, because now you have, and I know it's hard to, I think someone mentioned earlier, the upselling part, right? Of getting an MSSP involved. But I think having introductions and having those conversations at least protects you, where they can't come back later and say that you didn't bring any of this up.
Yeah, I think, and I'm going to put a URL in chat. This is from the cyber call a few weeks ago with Brian Blakely, who's a master at having risk to revenue conversations. It's really important around these security controls to make sure that we talk about the business versus the technical. So, hey, you were telling me that this particular application represents 80% of your revenue. There's some weaknesses in it that I'm really concerned about. Let me kind of walk you through that. If these weaknesses are exploited, right? It could cost you, based on what you tell me you generate in revenue every single day from the system, it could cost you approximately $430,000 over the next 6 days. And so if you walk them through that you have structural weaknesses and that you have concerns, and maybe I'm not doing, I'm concerned because I'm not doing, you're not taking this recommendation. I feel like I'm not doing my job because you're not taking this recommendation. Can we back up here? Because this is the most critical system in your organization that supports this, and you have SLAs with these and these and these customers. So again, I kind of implore, come back to always bring it back to their business and something they can understand versus the technical terms that we understand. Does that make sense to you, Spencer?
Bottom line revenue, right? I don't talk to people in terms of legal. I try not to. I talk to them about their bottom lines, right? I mean, the legal is there, the technical is there, but it's the reputational and it's the financial. That's what catches people's eyes, right?
Yeah.
They just look at the law, they look at technical as like somebody else is dealing with it. But when you start talking about dollars, that's going to catch their attention.
Mm-hmm.
And we have everybody here is objective measures and objective numbers. Like these are not guesswork. This is not something that all of us are guessing on. We have statistics, we have research that is well-founded.
Yeah. So kind of maybe just, and again, if you guys have questions, I'd love them as we kind of start to wrap up the last few questions here, Spencer. Are there things from a SaaS and cloud expectation setting, that we need to do differently? Again, it's all, comes back to, I think, the legal, the MSA, but again, I think there's this, and it's already been said in chat, this misnomer that because it's in the cloud, because it's SaaS, it's safe, it has security around it. Should we be going back and resetting the expectations with everybody, since, workloads have been shifted and those types of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think you really what I try to make clear to clients is that just because it's in the cloud, that doesn't mean secure, right? It just means it's new level of technology, but it all goes back to people and the process and what they're willing to have you do and what they're expecting you to do. And it's having a conversation, just a very basic conversation, that just because you're in the cloud, you're not secure. You're not, unless you're doing certain things that you were supposed to be doing before. And this shouldn't be the exception anymore. I mean, these services that we're talking about with MSPs and their customers, you should start baking these into what you're offering and how much, and price it, whatever you have to price it and quote it as such. But once again, there's that expectation that you're already doing it. So I think this needs to become the rule rather than the exception.
Okay. And I'm wondering about Michael's comment or question, Michael, maybe you can expand man in the middle compromises with real estate. Do you mean, again, having the supposed, why am I drawing a blank on the title company saying change, X to Y account? Is that where you're going there, Michael? And while Michael, yeah. So are you seeing any increases there on those types of?
I wouldn't say real estate transactions specifically, but I think we have seen more man in the middle compromises. I think we've seen more of the transactional changes, with the numbers, because it's easy, it's cost effective, and it works pretty well. But real estate specific, I wouldn't say I've seen a big spike in that. Now, I mean, you say you've seen some large loan payoffs. That's interesting. I mean, I could see it happening because it's an easy way. I think title companies are I've seen a lot more title companies getting hit with more ransomware, but less the BEC side.
Interesting. Spencer, I'm going to put you on the spot here. You're an MSP. What we know today about identity shifting to the cloud with Azure, O365, et cetera, the fact that you need, you should, right, for any SaaS application should have MFA enabled. Are you baking it in? Are you making it option? Are you giving any option these days for monitoring these environments or protecting these environments if you're an MSP?
I wouldn't personally. I mean, it's such a necessity right now. And I think, once again, it's also what you can tell your client when it comes to insurance, at least, is that it's going to make you much more attractive to an insurer if you have somebody monitoring this for them and actively doing it. But I think just best practices, this needs to happen, right? Because they're too vulnerable without it.
Right.
Because once again, I think your cyber defense matrix is really good. It's technology, people, process.
Mhm.
People are always the weak point. Technology is going to be pretty good.
Mhm.
But you need to get that baked into your process and
Right.
baked into what you're doing with the customer.
Right. Fantastic. Questions as we close things out here, Spencer. I'm just looking at Michael's comments. Wow. Spencer, kind of maybe close things out here for what was 2022 like? Did you work with more MSPs? Have you seen positives come out of the last few years as MSPs are evolving, becoming security first, in terms of, how they view their businesses? Talk to us about what you've seen. Talk about maturing, how you're working with MSPs. It'd be great to close us out.
Yeah, I mean, truthfully, I'm not even blowing smoke here. I think, Andrew, people like you and the associations that you've built have been a huge impact on educating the MSP community. I found a couple years ago, it was a much more immature community out there. Whereas, it's still the Wild West, but there was no cohesion, right? And people just were throwing up a shingle left and right. And I think as we've moved forward, the more mature organizations are getting ahead of it and doing everything we're saying, requiring clients to have that MFA across the board, setting those better expectations, have tighter MSAs, having the conversations with their clients, incorporating external parties, right? Not feeling like they're going to get fired. 3 years ago, every time I'd come into an incident during an incident or beforehand, an MSP thought that I was trying to get them fired, like instantaneously. But now I found that the better ones are very much appreciative of the role that external parties are playing because it's the collaborative environment. And I think MSPs have gotten much better about trying to carve out, if they're going to do security too, the good ones are really laying out the expectation settings. Now, the ones that don't want to do security are also the good ones are laying out the expectations that they're not doing that. So I think you're going to continue to see that. I think in 2022, what we saw was MSPs were a huge vulnerability point because I have a couple right now where I have downstream customers of an MSP. Imagine, you guys hold the keys to the castle. And the good ones out there, like the Kaseya event. Wait, was that 20? That was 2021, wasn't it? That was a long time ago. I thought it was 2022. But similar to that, the ones that really are in a good position, have the good relationships with their clients and customers, have been proactive and had those conversations. The ones that have always raised my kind of the hair on the back of my neck, my eyebrows, are the ones that get defensive, that have not had those conversations or have had the conversations that aren't doing it. So, but I think moving forward, I'm pretty impressed with good MSPs. And I think everybody in this community, everybody in this call, likely everybody on the Cyber Nation call, have always seemed to me and always come off as being more mature, more intelligent, and more forward thinking.
Cool. Well, with that, we appreciate everybody coming on today, late in 2022, wishing everybody a happy and healthy new year. Spencer, thank you so much for joining us and being selfless with your time. Michelle and the crew at SaaS Alerts, thanks for putting this together and getting Spencer here with us. So on behalf of that, wishing everybody a happy and healthy remainder of 2022, and we'll see you in 2023.
Thank you all.
Everyone.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.